Chile has made a decision that is shocking Wall Street and redefining the entire landscape of neoliberal economics in Latin America. The government in Santiago has officially rejected a decades-old financial agreement that tied its economy to U.S.-dominated banking institutions, signaling a seismic shift in how South American nations view economic sovereignty. This isn't just another policy adjustment. This is Chile walking away from the very model that made it the darling of Western economists for 40 years. What's happening behind this decision goes far deeper than headlines suggest, and the implications extend far beyond Chile's borders. This move threatens to unravel the financial architecture that has kept Latin America within Washington's economic orbit since the Cold War ended. Yet mainstream media is treating this as a minor story, a local dispute, nothing to see here. They're wrong. What Chile just did could trigger a domino effect across the developing world, and it reveals something crucial about the dying days of American financial hegemony. But first, we need to understand how Chile became the laboratory for the economic model it's now abandoning. To understand why this moment is so crucial, we must go back to September 11th, 1973, not the September 11th you're thinking of. This one happened in Chile when a US-backed military coup overthrew the democratically elected socialist government of Salvador Allende. What followed wasn't just political repression, it was the birth of an economic experiment that would shape the next half-century of global capitalism. The Pinochet dictatorship, with direct guidance from University of Chicago economists, turned Chile into the world's first laboratory for radical free market restructuring. They privatized everything: state industries, pension funds, utilities, education, healthcare. They opened the economy completely to foreign capital. They gutted labor protections and handed control of the nation's resources to multinational corporations and Wall Street banks. This wasn't organic economic development. This was forced transformation under military rule where dissent meant torture or disappearance. The architects of this system called it the Chilean miracle. It produced impressive GDP growth figures that economists love to cite, but it also produced catastrophic inequality, debt servitude for the middle class, and the systematic extraction of Chile's wealth by foreign financial institutions. For decades, Chile was held up as the success story. The proof that neoliberalism worked. International financial institutions used Chile as the template for structural adjustment programs imposed on countries from Argentina to Zambia. Accept foreign investment, privatize state assets, deregulate your markets, tie your currency and debt to dollar-denominated instruments controlled by New York banks. In exchange, you get access to credit, foreign investment, and a seat at the table of the global economy. The system seemed unshakable because it was enforced by every lever of power the West controlled. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank made compliance a condition of lending. Trade agreements locked in investor protections that superseded national law. Credit rating agencies punished any deviation from orthodoxy, and behind it all stood the implicit threat that challenging the system meant isolation, sanctions, or worse. Chile played by these rules for 4 decades. Even after democracy returned in 1990, successive governments maintained the basic architecture of the Pinochet-era economic model. They softened some edges, added social programs, but never fundamentally challenged the system until now. For decades, this system seemed unshakable, but something changed. In October 2019, Chile exploded, not from foreign agitation or economic collapse, but from within. Students protesting a subway fare increase sparked the largest mass uprising in the country's history. Millions took to the streets demanding an end to the neoliberal model. They burned metro stations. They toppled statues. They forced the government to agree to rewrite the constitution that Pinochet had imposed. The uprising revealed what economic statistics had hidden. Chileans were drowning in private debt. 78% of households were in debt, much of it to pay for privatized services that were public goods elsewhere. Retirement pensions were so low that elderly Chileans lived in poverty despite working their entire lives. Healthcare and education costs crushed the middle class. And behind every privatized service, every debt instrument, every pension fund, stood Wall Street institutions extracting profit. The constitutional process that followed became a battleground over Chile's economic future. Progressive forces won a supermajority in the Constituent Assembly. They drafted a constitution that would have fundamentally restructured the economy, guaranteeing social rights and limiting foreign control over natural resources. Wall Street and Chilean oligarchs mobilized every resource to defeat it. They won the first referendum in 2022 through a massive disinformation campaign. But the genie was out of the bottle. The demand for economic sovereignty wasn't going away. In 2023, Gabriel Boric's government began quietly renegotiating Chile's relationship with international financial institutions. Not loudly, not dramatically, but systematically, they started creating space for economic policy independence. They strengthened capital controls. They increased taxes on foreign mining companies. They expanded the role of the state-owned copper company. Each step was modest. Each step was legal. But together, they signaled a direction Wall Street couldn't ignore. And then, 3 months ago, everything accelerated. What happened next is where the story gets really interesting. In late 2025, the Chilean government received what officials described as an ultimatum from a consortium of international banks and investment funds. The details weren't made public, but leaks to Chilean media painted a clear picture. The financial institutions demanded that Chile roll back recent regulatory changes, guarantee no further restrictions on capital flows, and commit to maintaining investor-friendly policies regardless of future political changes. In essence, they wanted Chile to constitutionally lock in neoliberalism forever. The leverage was simple. Chile has significant dollar-denominated debt. Much of it needs to be refinanced in the coming years. The banks made clear that Chile's access to international credit markets depended on compliance. This wasn't a negotiation, this was financial coercion. The Chilean government had a choice: comply and surrender economic sovereignty, or refuse and face potential financial isolation. For 40 years, every Chilean government had chosen compliance when faced with this choice. This time, something different happened. On November 15th, 2025, Chile's finance minister stood before cameras and announced that Chile would not be renewing its participation in certain financial agreements that subordinated national economic policy to foreign creditor demands. She didn't name specific institutions. She used careful diplomatic language, but the message was unmistakable. Chile was walking away from the table. Wall Street was stunned. Rating agencies immediately threatened downgrades. Financial media warned of capital flight and economic crisis. The U.S. State Department expressed concern about Chile's commitment to its international obligations, but Chile didn't back down. What traditional media is not reporting is what happened in the 48 hours before that announcement. Chilean officials held emergency consultations with counterparts in Beijing, Moscow, and several Latin American capitals. They secured commitments for alternative financing arrangements that would allow Chile to weather any Wall Street retaliation. China agreed to expand currency swap lines, providing dollars if needed without IMF conditions. Russia offered energy cooperation agreements that would stabilize costs. Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina signaled support for regional financial mechanisms that could bypass New York banks. This wasn't a spontaneous decision. This was a coordinated strategic move that had been planned for months. Behind the scenes, Chilean officials had been documenting exactly how much wealth was being extracted from their economy through the existing financial architecture. The numbers were staggering. Over the past 2 decades, foreign investors and financial institutions had extracted more than $200 billion in profits from Chile. That's equivalent to nearly 80% of Chile's current GDP. Most of it went to accounts in New York, London, and other Western financial centers. Meanwhile, Chile remained classified as a developing nation with persistent poverty and inequality. The officials realized they were trapped in a system designed not to develop their economy, but to extract from it. The decision to reject the Wall Street Agreement was also driven by domestic political calculation. The Boric government faced potential electoral defeat if it couldn't deliver economic change. The right-wing opposition was surging by campaigning against economic hardship. But that same opposition was tied to the oligarchs who benefited from the current system. By taking on Wall Street directly, Boric could outflank the right and mobilize the social movement base that had been frustrated by the slow pace of change. It was politically risky, but doing nothing was riskier. There's another dimension here that connects to broader global trends. Chile's move comes as dozens of countries are quietly restructuring their relationships with the dollar-dominated financial system. Saudi Arabia is accepting yuan for oil sales. India is buying Russian energy in rupees. Argentina is exploring yuan settlement for trade. The BRICS nations are building alternative payment systems. What Chile is doing isn't happening in isolation. It's part of a global shift away from a financial architecture where Washington and Wall Street set the rules and everyone else complies or suffers. The timing is also crucial. The United States is increasingly distracted by domestic political chaos and great power competition with China. Its bandwidth for enforcing economic discipline in Latin America is limited. U.S. military and intelligence resources are focused on Ukraine, Taiwan, and the Middle East. Latin America has fallen down the priority list. Chilean strategists understood this. They saw a window of opportunity where Washington's ability to retaliate was constrained. They also calculated that the U.S. needs Chile more than it wants to admit. Chile controls a third of the world's lithium reserves, essential for the green energy transition and electric vehicle batteries. The U.S. cannot afford to completely isolate Chile when it needs access to those resources to compete with China in the technology race. But there's something more important that mainstream analysts are missing. This isn't just about one agreement or one country. This is about the end of an era where developing nations had no choice but to accept terms dictated by Western financial institutions. For 70 years, the system worked because there was no alternative. If you wanted access to capital, technology, and global markets, you had to go through New York and Washington. That's no longer true. China offers financing without political conditions. Regional blocs offer trade in local currencies. Technology transfer no longer requires Western approval. The monopoly is broken. And once one country successfully breaks free, others will follow. At this point, I need to step back from emotion and look at this through a realist lens. In international relations theory, there's a well-established understanding of how hegemonic powers maintain control over smaller states. It's not primarily through military force, it's through economic structures that create dependency. You make other countries reliant on your currency, your banks, your markets. You control the institutions that set the rules of global trade and finance. You use debt as leverage to influence their domestic policies. This isn't conspiracy. This is standard great power behavior that every dominant state throughout history has practiced. The United States built this system brilliantly after World War II. The Bretton Woods institutions, the dollar as global reserve currency, the web of bilateral and multilateral trade agreements that all flowed through American-dominated structures. It gave Washington enormous power to shape the policies of other nations without firing a shot. But here's the thing about hegemonic systems. They only work as long as there's no alternative, and as long as the hegemon has the power to punish defection. When either condition fails, the system starts to crack. We're now in that phase. China has created alternative institutions, the Belt and Road Initiative, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the New Development Bank. These aren't perfect substitutes for Western institutions, but they don't need to be. They just need to be good enough that countries have options. Meanwhile, American power to punish defection has weakened, not because the U.S. military is less capable, but because the costs of enforcement have risen while the benefits have declined. The United States cannot afford to wage economic war on every country that steps out of line. It has to pick its battles. And when it does choose confrontation, as with sanctions on Russia or Iran, it often drives those countries deeper into alternative systems rather than bringing them to heel. This creates a security dilemma for the hegemon. If you don't punish defection, more countries defect. But if you do punish defection harshly, you accelerate the development of alternative systems. Either way, your dominance erodes. From Chile's perspective, this is entirely rational behavior. They looked at the costs and benefits of staying in the U.S.-dominated financial system versus exploring alternatives. The costs of staying were clear. Continued wealth extraction, limited policy autonomy, vulnerability to financial coercion, and domestic political instability from an angry population. The benefits were access to cheap credit and avoiding retaliation, but those benefits were declining. Credit wasn't that cheap anymore after years of interest rate increases, and retaliation was less threatening when alternatives existed. Meanwhile, the costs of defection were falling. China and others offered financing, regional cooperation reduced isolation risk, and commodity prices for copper and lithium gave Chile leverage. So Chile did what any rational state would do in that position. It pursued its national interests by reducing dependency on a system that no longer served it well. This is also about signaling. Chile isn't trying to become an enemy of the United States. It's trying to redefine the relationship on more equal terms. By demonstrating that it has alternatives, Chile increases its bargaining power. If Wall Street wants access to Chilean markets and resources, it will have to offer better terms. This is negotiations through action. It's hardball, but it's not irrational. And here's what makes this particularly significant. Chile isn't a typical left-wing populist government that the West can easily dismiss. This is a democratically elected, internationally respected administration making calculated strategic choices. They're not burning bridges, they're renegotiating terms. That makes their model more replicable for other countries. The realist framework also helps us understand why the U.S. response has been relatively muted so far. Washington looks at Chile and sees a middle power with resources it needs in a region where Chinese influence is already growing at a time when U.S. attention is divided across multiple global challenges. Crushing Chile economically would be expensive, might not work, and would drive Santiago closer to Beijing. Better to try to contain the damage, prevent other countries from following suit, and hope that market pressures eventually force Chile back into line. That's a rational calculation from Washington's perspective. But it's also an admission that American power to shape Latin American politics has limits. What we're witnessing is the slow motion collapse of the post-Cold War unipolar order. not through dramatic military conflict, but through 1,000 small acts of economic sovereignty. Each one seems manageable. But together, they're reshaping the architecture of global power. Chile's decision is one more beam pulled from the structure. And every beam that's removed makes the next one easier to pull. This isn't just about Chile anymore. The consequences will affect the entire developing world and ultimately the United States itself. In the immediate term, watch for other Latin American countries to test similar moves. Argentina, despite its current right-wing government, is already exploring yuan trade settlement. Brazil has been vocal about reducing dollar dependency. Mexico, despite its proximity to the U.S., is quietly diversifying its economic relationships. If Chile successfully navigates the next 6 to 12 months without economic collapse, it becomes a proof of concept that others will study closely. The message will be clear. You can say no to Wall Street and survive. That's revolutionary. For the entire region, this move creates permission space. For decades, Latin American governments believed they had no choice but to accept the Washington consensus. Even left-wing governments that rhetorically opposed neoliberalism largely maintained its structures in practice. The fear of capital flight, credit cutoffs, and economic crisis was too great. Chile is now testing whether that fear was justified or whether it was a bluff. If it's a bluff, everything changes. Regional integration projects that failed before because individual countries were too vulnerable might become viable when multiple countries coordinate their exit from dollar dependency. The implications extend to global commodity markets. Chile is the world's largest copper producer and holds the largest lithium reserves. If Chile successfully asserts more control over these resources and directs more of their value toward national development rather than foreign profits, it changes the math for every country with significant natural resources. Nigeria with oil, Indonesia with nickel, Democratic Republic of Congo with cobalt, they're all watching the resource curse, where countries rich in resources remain poor because extraction benefits foreign companies might be reversible. That would fundamentally alter the economics of the green energy transition and the global supply chains for critical minerals. For the international financial system, this is a stress test. Can the dollar-based architecture survive if major commodity exporters start demanding payment in other currencies or insisting on more favorable terms? The system's defenders will say yes, that Chile is too small to matter. But systems don't collapse all at once. They erode gradually as more participants defect. Sanctions on Russia already accelerated de-dollarization among countries that feared they might be next. Iran built an entire shadow economy to survive sanctions. Now, Chile is demonstrating that you don't need to be sanctioned to choose alternatives. You can proactively reduce dependency while maintaining relationships with the West. That's a more dangerous precedent because it's more replicable. There are also security implications that defense analysts are starting to recognize. U.S. influence in Latin America has historically rested on a combination of economic integration and security cooperation, military aid, training programs, counter-narcotics partnerships. These were all built on a foundation of economic interdependence. If that foundation weakens, the security architecture weakens too. Countries less dependent on U.S. markets and financing are less responsive to U.S. security priorities. That matters for everything from migration policy to Chinese military presence in the region. The U.S. has long kept China's military footprint in Latin America minimal. That becomes harder if China is the primary economic partner for multiple countries in the region. Think about this for a moment. What happens to U.S. leverage in its own hemisphere if the countries there have genuine alternatives? The Monroe Doctrine only worked because the United States could credibly threaten to destroy any government that aligned with rival powers. That threat is less credible now. You can't regime change your way out of a multipolar world. And economic coercion only works if you control access to credit and markets. As those conditions erode, so does hegemony. In the next 5 to 10 years, we'll see a fundamental restructuring of economic relationships between the developed and developing world. The era of structural adjustment, where poor countries had to accept rich countries' terms to access global economy, is ending. The new era will be characterized by transactional relationships where developing countries play rival powers off each other to get better deals. That's not necessarily good or bad. It's just different. It means more economic sovereignty for developing nations, but also more complexity and potential instability as the established order breaks down before a new one fully forms. For ordinary people, the implications are mixed. In Chile specifically, if the gamble works, it could mean more resources staying in the country for education, healthcare, and infrastructure instead of being extracted as profits. It could mean cheaper energy and services if state involvement increases, but it also means uncertainty, potential short-term economic disruption, and the risk that if Chile's alternative financing arrangements fall through, there could be a serious crisis. The next year will be crucial. If Chile maintains economic stability and demonstrates that life goes on outside the Wall Street consensus, that's transformative. If the economy implodes, it reinforces the narrative that there is no alternative. Globally, the impact on prices is already beginning. Copper prices spiked after Chile's announcement as markets priced in uncertainty about supply. Lithium futures are volatile as investors try to figure out whether Chile will restrict exports or demand higher prices. These are inputs for everything from construction to electronics to electric vehicles. If Chile's move leads to a broader trend of resource nationalism, expect sustained higher prices for critical materials. That feeds inflation in developed economies and makes the green transition more expensive. It also potentially redistributes wealth from consumers in rich countries to producers in poor countries. That's politically explosive. Chile has demonstrated that the era of unquestioned financial hegemony is over. What we're witnessing is not simply a policy dispute or economic reform, but a fundamental challenge to the architecture of power that has defined global capitalism for half a century. When a middle power can walk away from agreements with the world's most powerful financial institutions and find alternatives, the rules have changed. As major powers compete and alternative institutions emerge, states will increasingly pursue their national interests without automatically deferring to Western preferences. This is the logic of great power competition playing out in the financial realm. This move marks the beginning of a new phase in Latin America's relationship with the United States. For 2 centuries, the Northern Colossus has been the dominant external power in the region. That's not ending, but it's becoming less absolute. The unipolar world is fragmenting, and Chile is positioning itself to have options in this new multipolar reality. Whether this leads to more development and democracy or to new forms of dependency on different powers remains to be seen. But the old order is dying, and what Chile just did brings that death one step closer